One day, Anne returns home to find her husband Pierre packing hastily. He explains that his ex-wife Rebecca called about their son, Theo, suspended from school for arguing with his math teacher. Pierre rushes to Geneva to bring Theo home to live with him. Anne is initially annoyed by Theo's messiness, but she notices he gets along well with his stepsisters Angela and Serena, who give him a handmade keychain. Anne finds the keychain on the driveway the next day and takes it inside. She's happy to see Theo bonding with the children, but becomes puzzled when he abruptly leaves the room upon seeing her. That night, Pierre returns home from work, exhausted and upset. Over dinner, he shares his work troubles with Anne, who listens attentively. Anne suggests they be intimate to help him feel better. In their bedroom, Pierre slowly undresses and opens up about his doubts and insecurities regarding Theo's comments about his age and parenting. Theo believes Pierre adopted Angela and Serena out of guilt and thinks Pierre is too old to be their father. While Pierre finds Theo's words hurtful, Anne sees Theo's kindness toward the children as a positive trait, which reassures Pierre. After being intimate, Pierre still feels insecure about his age, but Anne comforts him by saying she finds older men attractive. The next day, Pierre visits Theo's room and gently asks him not to smoke indoors, to which Theo reluctantly agrees. Pierre then tries to have a serious conversation with him about reciprocating their hospitality. But Theo only half-heartedly agrees and brushes him off to focus on his phone. When Pierre asks about Theo's work, Theo avoids the question, leading Pierre to doubt his honesty. Pierre confronts Theo about being a freeloader, which angers Theo, causing Pierre to leave the room feeling disappointed by Theo's attitude. Shortly after his departure, Anne and her friend Mimi arrive at the house to find it in disarray, signaling a robbery. Anne immediately calls Pierre to inform him. While on the phone, Theo casually approaches and inquires about the situation. Anne briefs him and instructs him to check his room for missing items. After Theo leaves, Mimi comments on Theo's kindness, but Anne mentions how he tends to ignore her, which she's okay with for now. The next day, Anne delivers good news to her clients Sarah and her father, Mr. Evrard, about Sarah being granted custody. Mr. Evrard accidentally spills Anne's coffee, but she assures him it's fine before continuing with the news, urging them not to squander the opportunity. Later, while changing, Anne discovers the keychain on Theo's pants, confused as she had kept it in her bag and hadn't taken it out. She confronts Theo, who remains nonchalant, and presses him for an explanation about the keychain, but Theo evades, expressing his annoyance at her probing. Despite this, Anne persists in seeking answers from him. Theo remains stubborn and unapologetic about the burglary at their home. Anne warns him she'll tell Pierre, but Theo brushes it off and dares her to call the police. Sensing Theo won't budge, Anne strikes a deal. She won't inform Pierre if Theo integrates into the family. Theo agrees, and soon after, he starts to come out of his shell. When Anne struggles with her daughter's swimming gear, Theo helps, earning her gratitude. He asks about the gear and joins Anne and the children for a swim when invited. During the outing, Theo invites Anne to join them in the river, but she declines, saying she's not in the mood. Theo playfully reminds her about integrating into the family, earning a smile. As the girls call Theo back to the water, Anne decides to join them. The next day, Anne chats with Theo on the patio, asking if he misses Genova. Theo admits he doesn't, sharing his dislike for the place and its people. Anne suggests he invite friends over, but Theo says he doesn't have any. Anne reveals she doesn't either, and they share a laugh. She notices Theo's forearm tattoo and asks about it. Proudly, Theo says he did it himself and offers to tattoo Anne, who declines due to fear of pain. They playfully argue. Anne continues to resist, but Theo playfully suggests tattooing near her elbows, calling it classy. After persistent offers, Anne finally agrees, and Theo starts tattooing. Despite the pain, Anne enjoys Theo's company. One night, while Anne is working, she hears Theo with a woman. Theo introduces Amanda, and she greets Anne before they retreat to his room, leaving her uneasy. A few days later, Anne skips a boring gathering and lounges on the stairs, where she sees Theo getting cigarettes. He invites her along, and they head to a bar for a drink. Anne, fueled by alcohol, asks about Amanda, wondering if she's Theo's girlfriend, but Theo denies it, saying they have a casual relationship. Curious, he asks about Anne's feelings for his father, but she deflects, sharing childhood memories instead. Theo asks about her mother's relationships, and Anne confirms she had many. Theo then turns the conversation to Anne's romantic history, but she avoids the question and finishes her drink. As Theo receives a text and prepares to leave, Anne asks if it's from Amanda, but Theo playfully dodges the question. Anne returns home cheerful, but Pierre is concerned. She lies about going for a walk, disappointing Pierre, who chastises her for disrespecting their guests. Anne remains unfazed, finding the gathering boring. The next evening, Theo is watching a TV series on his phone when Anne visits his room. He invites her to join him, and she agrees. As they watch, tension builds, and Theo kisses Anne, leading to intimacy. Afterward, Anne feels guilty and tells Theo to forget what happened and not to do it again. But Theo doesn't reassure her, and instead asks if she enjoyed it. Anne reluctantly admits she did, but expresses regret. Theo tries to comfort her with playful teasing, but Anne is unamused, and Theo calls her irritating, prompting her to leave. In the following days, Theo spends time with his stepsisters in the backyard before approaching Anne, who's sunbathing, and offers her a beer. They chat, and Theo starts interviewing Anne with a dictaphone, initially asking innocent questions to get to know her better. But as the interview progresses, Theo becomes more suggestive, asking Anne about her first time. Uncomfortable, Anne refuses to answer, which disappoints Theo. Anne admits something shouldn't have happened, leading Theo to believe she's referring to their intimacy. Despite Anne's denial, Theo insists they're in a relationship and kisses her. Anne still refuses to acknowledge it, so Theo kisses her as an apology. The next day, Anne visits Sarah, who has been unreachable. She expresses her concern, but Sarah acts differently, raising Anne's suspicions. When they hear Sarah's father's voice from inside, Anne invites Sarah for a walk, hoping to talk, but Sarah refuses and asks her to leave. Outside, Anne contacts Child Protection Services for Sarah's case file. On Serena's birthday, Theo helps Anne set up tables but becomes too touchy. Anne reprimands him for his behavior. During the party, Serena asks Anne to fill her water gun, and as Anne heads to the shed, Theo hugs her despite her protests. Anne gives in, losing focus. Mimi witnesses the incident but decides not to intervene, disappointed. Anne tries to stop Mimi from leaving, but Mimi is determined. The next day, Theo meets Anna in the garden, and she scolds him for his behavior at the party, reminding him to keep their affair secret. Theo promises. He asks if Anne is breaking up with him, and she confirms, saying their affair must end. Theo asks for a goodbye kiss, and Anne grants it. As Theo leaves, he shouts at Anne, resenting the breakup, and declares he'll have other girlfriends, not needing her anymore. The next morning, Anne joins Pierre for breakfast, and he tells her he's taken a week off to bond with Theo. This rattles Anne, fearing Pierre might discover their affair. Nevertheless, she maintains composure and agrees that repairing their relationship might be beneficial. Later that evening, Anne searches Theo's nightstand for a dictaphone, hoping to erase the tape containing their affair conversation. She finds it, takes the tape, and leaves. The following day, Anne drops her daughters off for horseback riding, feeling agitated. While driving home, she searches for her phone, causing a distraction and a car accident. Forced to leave the car, they return home using a cab. They find Pierre's car already in the driveway. Anne's daughters inform Pierre about the accident, but he shows no concern. During dinner, Anne wonders about Theo's whereabouts. Pierre reveals Theo won't join them, implying he's with Amanda. Anne's assumption is confirmed by Pierre's knowing look. He mentions encountering mice on their trip, subtly hinting at Anne's infidelity by talking about the trouble caused by reproducing mice. Anne falls silent, and when Pierre asks why she's not eating, she claims to have lost her appetite. By evening, Pierre confronts Anne about Theo's confession regarding their affair. Anne initially remains silent, but Pierre's prodding prompts her to try to save face. Their conversation quickly escalates into an argument. Anne, instead of admitting the truth, deflects and accuses Theo of being miserable and a liar. Pierre, troubled by the situation, admits he's unsure whom to believe at first. However, he questions why Theo would fabricate such a story in such detail if it weren't true. Anne insists Theo concocted the story for attention, and argues it's unlikely for her to be involved with a teenager. Despite her attempts to defend herself, Pierre remains skeptical, as Theo provided significant details about their affair. Frustrated, Anne storms out of the room, but not before reminding Pierre of the effort she's put into making their relationship interesting. Anne hastily begins packing her belongings, ignoring Pierre's attempts to stop her. Instead, she manipulates Pierre, suggesting Theo confessed out of revenge for feeling abandoned. Pierre pleads with her not to leave and expresses his confusion about whom to believe. Anne seizes the opportunity to portray Theo as a manipulative monster, blaming him for the burglary incident and implying he wants Pierre to reject her so he can have his father back. She further appeals to Pierre's sympathy by claiming she kept Theo's behavior secret to give him a second chance and protect their relationship. Anne goes further, criticizing Pierre for being easily manipulated. Pierre, fearing the loss of his wife, tearfully embraces her. The next morning, Pierre calls Theo into the living room and reprimands him for accusing Anne of infidelity. Feeling betrayed, Theo hesitates, looking at Anne, who remains composed. He insists he didn't lie and urges Anne to speak up. However, Pierre orders him to apologize to Anne. Confidently, Anne reassures Pierre and scolds Theo, treating him like a troubled attention seeker. This deeply hurts Theo, causing him to label them crazy. Again, Pierre demands Theo admit to lying, unaware of Theo's pain. Anne approaches Theo, gently urging him to confess, portraying herself as innocent. Instead, Theo abruptly leaves. Moments later, he's packed and ready to go, but his sisters don't want him to leave. As he says goodbye, he tightly hugs them. At Anne's workplace, her coworker alerts her about Theo's presence. She calls him to her office to discuss the situation. Theo threatens to press charges against Anne if she doesn't confess to Pierre. Despite the threats, Anne remains steadfast, believing their situation isn't criminal and that Theo lacks evidence of their affair. So, she advises him to simply tell Pierre the truth, admitting that he lied. Understanding that convincing Theo would be futile, he storms out of her office. A few days later, Anne attends a meeting with Theo's lawyer, where the boy brings charges against her. Despite Anne's attempts to leverage her connections with the lawyer, he remains steadfast. Forced to accept the lawyer's proposal, Anne bids a shaken Theo farewell before leaving. Later that evening, Anne hears loud banging downstairs and investigates. She finds a drunk Theo at the door, insisting on seeing her despite their agreement. Confused, Anne reminds him of their deal, but he ignores her. Theo, driven by desire, kisses Anne, and although she tries to resist, she ultimately succumbs. After their intimate moment, Anne returns to her room, where Pierre, half asleep, asks about the commotion. Anne fabricates a story about Theo's drunken visit and arranging a cab for him. Sensing her distress, Pierre comforts her, and, as she snuggles into him, she calls out his name. Pierre hushes her, urging her to go back to sleep.